Hi everyone, welcome to this revision video for OCR GCSE History Making America. This video is going to focus on Civil War and Reconstruction, 1861 to 1877, looking at the key question, did the Civil War change America? We're going to talk about the causes of the American Civil War and how it was very much the core kind of cause is slavery. We're going to talk about the experience of African Americans during the American Civil War. We're going to talk about positive and negative changes for African Americans or Black Americans. And then we're going to talk about the era of Reconstruction. We're going to test W.E.B. Du Bois's theory of the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. And we're going to think about some of the positive and negative impacts of that era of Reconstruction on the lives of African Americans. So let's find out more. Okay, so this is the syllabus for this topic, Civil War and Reconstruction. You need to know about divisions over slavery and the cause of the Civil War, the African American experience of the Civil War, and Reconstruction and continuing limitations to African American liberty. Okay, and this is where it fits in with the timeline of American history. So just note that this topic is on at the same time as settlement and conflict on the plains, but we're very much looking at 1861 to 1877 here. Okay, so we're going to talk about the cause of the Civil War. Now, it's quite a complex topic, this one, so you might want to watch this a couple of times just to make sure you've got it. And we've got a nice, helpful summary at the end just to kind of help you out. So in 1861, the northern and southern states of the USA went to war with each other. Now, the American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, a very tragic event. 750,000 died during the Civil War. Now, the Civil War is fought between the northern and southern states of the USA, as shown on the map to the side. The northern states were known as the Union and the southern states as the Confederacy. Now, the tensions that led to the American Civil War had been around for years. However, the trigger factor was the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, which brought the tensions to the fore and sparked the Civil War. So that's very sort of kind of brief summary of the Civil War for you. So slavery is obviously going to be a key issue identified in any kind of analysis on the causes of the Civil War. Now, the Civil War is caused by political, economic and social divisions which have built up for years. Now, it's very important to know there are huge differences between the North and South as detailed below. The North did not have slavery, whereas the South did, and slavery was responsible for the strong economy across the USA, making both the North and South rich. So the North, the Union side, a modern capitalist system where people can make profits, mixed economy, bit of farming, small businesses and big factories in the cities, like New York, for example, or Chicago. They made money through the work of paid employees, and they believed that slavery was unfair competition for business and factory owners as slaves were not paid. Now the South, that's the Confederate side in the Civil War, a semi-modern plantation system dominated by a few powerful slaveholders. Mostly agriculture, dominated by large plantations, very little industry. Made money through work of slave labour, cotton growing was a huge business, and they believed that slavery was natural, and modern factories and capitalist businesses made white workers into wage slaves. So the North does not have slavery, but the South does have slavery. Okay, so the first thing, if you've got a question about the cause of the Civil War, you need to know that long-term tensions over slavery caused the American Civil War. Now, we talked about the divisions over slavery between the North and the South in the very first inquiry when America was growing from 1789 to 1838, and we talked about how it created political tensions. There was tensions between the slave and the free states over who would have the balance of power in the federal government. And of course that led to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, where states were added in pairs, one slave and one free. This helped to keep a lid on the political tensions caused by slavery. So remember, the Missouri Compromise is not a cause of the Civil War. The Missouri Compromise is a solution to the tensions that were being created. So if we ever find that the Missouri Compromise gets eroded, then that's going to be a cause of the Civil War. Now, one of the other long-term tensions over slavery is the abolitionists. Abolitionists are people in the North against slavery. For example, in 1831, William Lloyd Garrison founded The Liberator, a newspaper that spread abolitionist views. In 1833, the National Anti-Slavery Society was formed, and by 1838 it had 250,000 members. Escaped enslaved people like Frederick Douglass, pictured there, wrote newspaper articles and spoke about life for enslaved people in the South, raising awareness. Northern abolitionists like Douglass and Harriet Tubman, a freed enslaved person as well, helped enslaved people escape slavery in the Underground Railroad. So basically a network of routes to enable people to escape from the South to the North. Now in 1851, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel which spoke about slavery, and it sold 2 million copies in 10 years. So by the 1850s, there were more and more abolitionists, resulting in long-term tensions. Now, tensions grew further in the 1850s because of the Clay Compromise, named after Kentucky Senator Henry Clay. As the USA expanded west in the 1840s and 1850s, it put more and more pressure on the Missouri Compromise, which, already established, kept a lid on the political tensions. In 1850, the California Gold Rush led to California becoming a state, and California was allowed to join as a free state under the Clay Compromise of 1850. The Clay Compromise allowed California to join as a free state, but new territories, Utah and New Mexico, would be allowed to vote on whether to be free or slave states. It also agreed the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens in free states to help in capturing and returning runaway slaves. The Clay Compromise weakened the Missouri Compromise, which had prevented tensions from spilling over into conflict. Now, the Clay Compromise led to further tensions in the 1850s. So between 1850 and 1854, it led to tension over whether slavery should be allowed to expand as the USA grew. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 said that states could decide for themselves if they want to be slave or free states, and that completely overrode the Missouri Compromise. It led to even more tensions between the two sides. It also led to something called Bleeding Kansas. This was an abolitionist and pro-slavery campaign that moved to Kansas before Kansas was voting on whether to be a free or a slave state. Fighting broke out and 200 were killed in violence that was known as Bleeding Kansas. So effectively a civil war was already being fought in Kansas in the 1850s. Now, partly as a response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Republican Party was set up in 1854 as an anti-slavery political party, and this just solidified tensions, made them worse. So the Republican Party was set up in 1854. The South relied on the Democrat Party, who supported states' rights and tended to be pro-slavery. Now, in 1856, a Democrat called James Buchanan became president, and his pro-slavery views led to many Northerners voting for the Republican Party. Buchanan also supported the 1857 Supreme Court ruling, the Dred Scott decision, that said slaves had no rights and that the US government could not ban slavery in territories. This made slaveholders powerful and further eroded the Missouri Compromise. Slaveholders in the South were afraid that the Republican Party would try to end slavery in the South altogether. Now, another cause of tension was John Brown, an abolitionist who tried to start a slave uprising in 1859 at Harper's Ferry in Virginia in the South. It was stopped and he was hanged, but he became a hero in the North and very much rallied abolitionist views. So we come to 1860 and we've got the election of the Republican Abraham Lincoln. Now, this is the trigger that sparked the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was portrayed as an honest, hard-working American. He wanted to preserve the Union and came to believe that getting rid of slavery was the best way to heal the divisions within the United States of America. So, Lincoln's election crystallized the divisions between the North and the South. States in the North wanted more control of their own states, and they resented the federal government interference. South Carolina was the first to secede, which means to leave, and other states soon followed. So, as a direct response to Lincoln winning the presidential election, South Carolina voted 169-0 to secede. In the winter of 1860 to 1861, another 6 states seceded. They were Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Now, the Confederate states elected their own government in Montgomery, Alabama, and Jefferson Davis, pictured there, became their president. In July 1861, the capital moved to Richmond, Virginia. Now, Lincoln didn't become president until March 1861. There's a big gap in America between when you get elected and when you become president. Now, when Lincoln became president, he said it was illegal that the Confederate states had left. He was not willing to let this happen. And he made a speech, very famous speech, saying the Confederacy was illegal. That led to Confederates opening fire at a place called Fort Sumter on Union soldiers. This was in South Carolina. And this is what started off the American Civil War. Okay, so this helpful diagram hopefully will just kind of remind you of some of the key reasons. So if you're thinking about the key reason, did slavery cause the American Civil War? Well, yes, in many ways slavery was the core issue of the Civil War, but other factors were influential too. So if you were going to write an argument about slavery, you'd probably write about long-term causes linked to slavery, talking about those abolitionists, talking about long-term political tensions which have been held at bay by the uneasy Missouri Compromise. Then you could talk about some of the short-term causes linked to slavery, like the Clay Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Republican Party, the Dred Scott Supreme Court verdict. A nice historical word to use would be that they all exacerbate tensions. But there are also differences between states' rights. There's tension between the North and the South over how much power states should have to control their own laws. South were more pro-states' rights, whereas the North were more pro-federal government. Secession was not just about slavery, but partly about states having control. For example, the Dred Scott Supreme Court case of 1857 had basically said that states should have the right to decide if they have slavery, but it's also about the right to decide other things in the states as well. There are also some very fundamental differences between the North and the South. The North was more industrial with more cities and factories. The South was more rural and agricultural with more farming work. There were economic and political and social rivalries between the North and the South of what types of businesses should be promoted and supported. So it's not just about slavery. Then, of course, the election of Lincoln is the trigger factor. Lincoln's election brought these long-term tensions to the surface, especially around slavery. Nearly all of his support came from the North. The South responded with South Carolina and then 6 other states seceding under rival President Jefferson Davis. Lincoln stated that this was illegal when he became president, causing the Civil War to begin. So the election of Lincoln is very much a trigger factor that creates this domino effect that allows the Civil War to break out in 1861. Okay. So we're now going to talk about the experience of black Americans during the Civil War between 1861 and 1865. So as we've seen here, the two sides in the Civil War were the North, the Union, and the South, the Confederacy. Now the Union states were led by President Lincoln, and that included 23 states such as California, Connecticut, Iowa, Ohio, Oregon, New York, Pennsylvania, and the capital was Washington, D.C. In terms of the South, it's led by Jefferson Davis, and the states included Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Tennessee, Louisiana, Texas, and the capital was initially Montgomery, Alabama, and then Richmond, Virginia. So in order to answer any question about change and the experience of black Americans during the Civil War, you need to know what the situation was like in 1861. So there is a big difference in the North because there's no slavery in the North, whereas in the South, most black Americans are slaves. So let's talk about the North to start off with. So in terms of the North, black workers could get jobs, but they did not get equal pay or rights. Black workers could not be in charge of white workers. A few black Americans got professional jobs such as lawyers and doctors. In terms of housing, many black Americans lived in poorer area of cities with high rents that were often made higher to sort of racially discriminate. A handful of professional black Americans did have better living conditions. In terms of education, most schools were segregated, which means they were separate for black and white students, but black students did have an access to a basic education. There were a few universities for black students, but they did find it harder to get jobs afterwards. And in terms of society, public places usually segregated, and there was a lot of racism against black people, especially from working class whites who saw them as competition for jobs. And that's a theme that we'll pick up when we talk about the draft riots during the American Civil War. In terms of the South, most black Americans are slaves. They can't get jobs or earn money. There are a few free black Americans in the South that could get work, but that was quite rare. In terms of housing, this is housing on the plantations. It's small, it's cramped, diseases spread easily, and medical care is non-existent. In most southern states, it's actually illegal for black Americans to learn to read or write. This was due to fears of uprisings. And in terms of society, enslaved people were treated as property rather than people, and they could not use any public facilities without permission. They often suffered from violence. So one of the most significant changes for black Americans in the South was the ending of slavery, and we're going to come on to this. So the first phase of the American Civil War is known as the limited phase, and that takes place between 1861 and 1862. Now at the start of the American Civil War, life for black Americans continued much as before. In the North, a rush of free black volunteers joined the Union Army in 1861, but they were not allowed to fight, and this is because Lincoln believed that allowing black Americans to serve in the Union Army might make some of the slave-holding border states join the Confederacy. Some enslaved people attempted to join the North and cross the battle lines. Lincoln passed a law saying that slaves could legally be held as, quote, contraband of war and could work for the Union Army. So in terms of the limited war phase, we're going to divide this up into positive changes and also limitations. So in terms of positive changes, by 1862, South Carolina was freed and ex-slaves began setting up regiments. One of the big case studies to talk about positive change in the limited war phase is the Sea Islands. So land in the Sea Islands, which are islands off the coast of South Carolina, was given to freed slaves from the South, and the 10,000 slaves on the Sea Islands were all freed. They set up a new town called Mitchellville. Missionaries came to teach the ex-slaves how to read and write, and this was known as the Sea Islands Experiment. Now, one volunteer was the black abolitionist heroine Harriet Tubman. She came to the Sea Islands to work as a nurse. In terms of limitations, the Union refused to commit to ending slavery throughout the whole of the USA in the limited phase of the war. Some escaped slaves were used to do hard labour, for example, digging ditches for the Union Army, and there was a lot of opposition to having black regiments during this limited phase. So one of the main limitations during this time period is that black people were not allowed to join the Union Army. So that's a good one to remember. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation was one of the most significant events of the American Civil War, and in the background to this is, in September 1862, Lincoln gave the Confederacy an ultimatum, a final warning, and he said he would free every last slave permanently if they did not surrender. No surrender came until Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on the 1st of January 1863. Now, to emancipate means to make free, and the proclamation just means an order. Now, this led to an increase in war between the two sides over the issue of slavery, and the war moves from the limited phase to the total war phase. This was a turning point in the history of the Civil War, but also in the rights of black Americans as well. The fact that slavery is going to get abolished should the Union win the Civil War. So the war becomes more intense now, and it's very much around the issue of slavery now, and that is the central kind of core issue, the fight in the Civil War, basically. So we're going to start off by looking at some of the positive changes associated with the total war period. So the US government sent missionaries to teach freed slaves how to read and write. Over 200,000 African Americans were taught to read and write by 1865. Ex-slaves took on jobs like field hand, mechanics and barbers, and thousands of freed slaves in the Deep South were promised 40 acres of land by General Sherman, a Union general, on the military advance through the South. Now, many ex-slaves did get to join the Union Army from 1862 and help to defeat the Confederacy. The first black regiment had been the South Carolina Volunteers, formed in autumn 1862. It's estimated around 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army, about 10% of the total. In January 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment became the first Northern Black Regiment. At first, black soldiers were paid less, but equal pay was granted in June 1864. Many black women supported the armed forces by working as cooks or nurses, such as Harriet Tubman and Susie Taylor King. Now, just a little note on the 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment. Please do note that the word coloured accurately describes what the regiment was called, but that is now seen as an offensive term. In terms of limitations, some slaves continued to work on cotton plantations even after they've been freed, and this is kind of like a forerunner of the idea of sharecroppers that we'll talk about in Reconstruction. Black soldiers were often given some of the worst jobs, late night guard duties, cleaning and ditch digging, and black soldiers were not allowed to serve as officers. The Conscription Act of 1863 required all men from 20 to 45 to join the Union Army, known as the draft. White working class were angry as they felt they were being forced to fight for the freedom of black Americans, and it led to the draft riots in New York in July 1863, which was 4 days of lynchings and attacking black people in the city. The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, would not be a full constitutional amendment until the war was over. So if you get a question about the sort of positive gains or limitations to African American liberty during the American Civil War, I would probably structure it in terms of positive impact in the limited phase, positive impact in the total war phase, and then looking at limitations of the limited phase of the war and limitations in terms of the total war phase of the war. And that would give you your 4 key arguments. Okay, let's move on and find out more about Reconstruction. Okay, so the years 1865 to 1877 were known as Reconstruction, and this was about bringing the USA back together after the American Civil War, and there were attempts to bring about civil rights for black Americans freed from slavery. There were times of progress and times of regress. The era can be understood in the following key phases. So the green ones show progress, so there's the era of presidential Reconstruction with President Lincoln. That includes the 13th Amendment and the Freedmen's Bureau. There is also progress with radical Reconstruction, which is when radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens dominated Congress and forced changes like the 14th and 15th Amendments. But the times of regress are the Reconstruction U-turn from President Johnson, who was a Southern Democrat who let Reconstruction slip, preferring to favour the reintegration of Southern states, and then Reconstruction rather lost its way from 1870 to 1877. The death of leading radical Republicans and the Democrat victory in the 1874 congressional elections led to the decline of Reconstruction, which formally ended in 1877. As W.E.B. Du Bois once said, and this is a really good quote to learn, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. And basically he's saying that there was huge limitations on the rights of black Americans during this time period. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln wins a second term and he sets about bringing about Reconstruction, including the 13th Amendment and Freedmen's Bureau. So Lincoln persuaded Congress to help make the Emancipation Proclamation the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in January 1865. He began trying to persuade the Union states to support the 13th Amendment and make it permanent. He set up the Freedmen's Bureau, a charity to help ex-slaves, which gave out land confiscated from plantation owners to ex-slaves. He also considered making black Americans citizens, and he wanted to ensure the South could not block black Americans from becoming citizens. So the 13th Amendment effectively banned slavery. So what Lincoln did is he made the Emancipation Proclamation permanent, and he got it into law, and that is a long-term impact that never went back on that. The African Americans were never slaves again. Now, the American Civil War formally ends on the 9th of April, 1865. 750,000 Americans had died, and unfortunately, Lincoln dies just after the end of the American Civil War, and that brings about President Johnson. Now, when Lincoln stood for president, he decided to have a Democrat as his vice president, I think in a way to try and reunite the country, probably not anticipating that if he died, then Johnson would become the president. And Johnson lets Reconstruction slip. He prefers the reintegration of southern states. So the main aims of President Johnson were to unite the country again. He was suspicious of the American government getting involved in state laws and forcing states to do things they disagreed with, very much believed in states' rights, and he believed that poor whites in the South needed protecting from the growth of big business in the North. So what did Johnson do? Well, he pardoned, forgave thousands of Confederate soldiers and plantation owners. He also returned many of their lands, including those in the Sea Islands. He put a stop to the work of the Freedmen's Bureau. He allowed southern states to re-establish their state governments and bring in black codes, which were laws which removed rights from black Americans. He allowed all Confederate states to rejoin the USA, even though some of them tried to vote against the 13th Amendment, which was, remember, all about banning slavery. And he did little to stop the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist group, being set up in 1865. In December 1865, Johnson had said that Reconstruction was finished. Now, Johnson was wrong about Reconstruction being finished because from 1866 to 1870, we have the era of radical Reconstruction. Now, radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens dominated Congress and forced changes, including the 14th and 15th Amendments. Many Republican politicians were very angry at Johnson for his U-turn on Reconstruction. In February 1866, they began forcing through their own changes. So in February 1866, the Freedmen's Bureau was re-established. In March 1866, Congress brought in a civil rights bill, a law to protect the rights of all black Americans. In April 1866, Congress proposed the 14th Amendment, which said that anyone born in the US is a US citizen, and it was approved in June 1866. Now, in November 1866, Republicans gained a huge majority in the congressional elections, allowing even more radical changes. So between March and July 1867, ex-Confederate governments were shut down and taken over by the North, and the military was sent to the South to protect the rights of black Americans. In July 1868, the 14th Amendment became law, which said that all people, no matter whether they're black or white, would be American citizens. This was a key event and overturned the Dred Scott case of 1857. In November 1868, though, President Johnson lost the presidential election to ex-Union General Ulysses S. Grant. In March 1870, the 15th Amendment gave all black Americans the right to vote. And by November 1870, more than 2,000 black Americans were voted into political office. Now, Ulysses S. Grant was a Republican, so things were now looking up in terms of the era of Reconstruction. So lots was done in that period of radical Reconstruction to improve the rights of black Americans. However, between 1870 and 1877, Reconstruction loses its way. This is partly due to the deaths of leading radical Republicans, and also the Democrat victory in the 1874 congressional elections led to the decline of Reconstruction, which formally ended in 1877. Now, there was lots of resistance in the South to Reconstruction. Many in the South said it was a way for corrupt Northerners to take control of land and money in the South. They said the Reconstruction program was being exploited by two groups, one called the Scalawags, which were people from the South who sympathised with Reconstruction policies, and one was the idea of carpetbaggers, people who moved to the South from the North to buy up ex-plantation land and sell it for profit. Their name came from the type of luggage they brought with them. Many white business owners grew rich out of Reconstruction. They won expensive contracts to build railways, factories, and make huge profits. And by the mid-1870s, many in the North and South began to believe the policies of Reconstruction were a mistake. Many in the South were worried about black Americans voting. By 1870, the policies of Reconstruction were beginning to slow. So some specific examples here of Reconstruction losing its way. In 1872, the Freedmen's Bureau was shut down, cutting off support for ex-slaves. Many black Americans were in reality working on plantations as sharecroppers. That's a key word to remember. Farmers who did not own their land. They were paid poorly and did not dare vote for radical Republicans for fear of losing their jobs because votes were not secret. Black citizens were being targeted by racist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and the White League. And President Grant did not help. He was worried the Reconstruction program was interfering in state governments. In 1873, the Supreme Court said that rights, including voting rights at state level, were the choice of the state, and this led to the reintroduction of segregation and led to voting rights kind of being eroded for black Americans. In 1875, the Supreme Court said it was not the role of the US government to stop black Americans being bullied out of voting booths. This made it harder for black people to vote, and Congress became dominated by ex-Confederate officers voted for by white voters. In 1877, the US government withdrew the soldiers it had stationed in the South after the war. Black citizens were left to defend themselves, and that's usually seen as the end of the Reconstruction era. So after 1870, many of the changes in favour of black Americans were reversed, and we can see here a cartoonist view of the life of black Americans in the South. It's basically talking about how the role of the Ku Klux Klan and groups like the White League, for example, meant that the lives of black Americans were little better than had been when they'd been enslaved. And W.E.B. Du Bois on Reconstruction, he was a black academic at the University of Atlanta in Georgia. He said the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. And I think that's a really good quote to learn to help you to really give some great analysis when looking at this topic. Okay, so thanks very much for listening to that revision video. I hope it's been useful, and good luck with your exams. Thank you very much. Goodbye.